So foot orthoses, or orthotics as most people know them, are obviously an extremely common treatment modality for foot pain conditions and even conditions further up the stream as well. Most people have, especially if you've had issues with your feet, you've probably been prescribed orthotics, or at least you know someone who has. And there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about orthotics and the way they work, and if they work, and for what conditions and so on. And we're certainly not against the use of orthotics. They can be a great tool in certain contexts. We do see that they tend to be overprescribed and potentially prescribed a lot without a plan to reduce the dependence on them over time. So it's a bit of a confusing space. I'm here with Andy, our head podiatrist for TFC, to help us navigate that space and hopefully leave you with some actionable tips on what you can do or how to think about your orthotics if you have some. So why don't we kick off with, like, where do these even come from? What's the go?
I think maybe in the 1920s, there was an idea that the foot was meant to be a certain shape and that we should try and bring the foot back to that shape. In the arch specifically. And so there were steel orthotics made, these quite chunky hard things, or maybe layers of leather. And it progressed and people were using them, and maybe they were helping because they created change. And then in the 60s and 70s, there's a big running boom and a whole lot of foot theory, as in theories about how the foot should work or should be. And unlike other parts of the body, when it came to foot theory, there's this idea that there's meant to be this perfect foot and everyone should move towards that. And if you're a long way from that perfect foot, you're more likely to get injured. And so an orthotic was used to bring you back to that perfect foot, or that normal foot.
That is kind of similar though. Around the same time, I'm sure there was these ideas of the perfect posture, the sort of fully upright, and people needing to be in this certain position, otherwise they would be likely to get pain. Whereas we're now understanding that that's not a correlation between posture and pain with the research that's coming out lately. Is it similar with feet?
Yeah, the feet have kind of been left behind. That we still, most people still think there should be this certain shaped arch for the foot, and that an orthotic might help you get to that arch if you have a problem with your foot, and that's going to solve the problem. And so early on, we probably thought they worked by changing the way the bones and joints moved, but because sometimes they do work. Often they do work.
When you say work, you mean they help reduce people's pain?
They help reduce people's pain. Yeah. And so someone comes with pain and we put an orthotic in place and the pain is reduced. It's now more accepted that probably makes a difference because it changes the way the muscles work in the area, brings some awareness of the body to use the foot in a different way, or changes the load to some extent. And doesn't mean it's changing it for the better, it's just moving it around. There's something called the tissue stress model. So if a tissue is under stress and we take some stress off it, then it settles down or doesn't hurt so much. It just moves the stress somewhere else. And
it makes sense. Like if let's say you've injured another body part, like your arm, maybe you've fractured your arm, you might want to keep it more still and more restricted for a time to help reduce the load while it heals. And then you'd probably want to build back the strength. But I guess that's the difference, isn't it? When people go into an orthotic, often they are in that, or they have that in their shoe for much longer periods of time than you would put any other body part under support.
Yeah,
right?
Well, often they're told they need it because they've got an arch that doesn't fit that norm. And so the orthotic is going to change it into that norm. And therefore, it's like a life sentence that you need the orthotic to make your foot better.
Yeah, so it's seen as a more fixed or permanent issue that the orthotic is solving, as opposed to a transient period of injury that then would, make sense to gradually rebuild the tissue capacity, or the strength, the mobility, the coordination of the area.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, if we've gone from the 60s and 70s looking at these orthotics trying to make the foot perfect or more normal, to understanding that it's probably changing the tissue stress. They're still being used, often with being told about that old way, but some people are still using them and becoming a bit more enlightened about their use because of the new way of thinking about them changing the tissue stress.
Yeah.
But if you're taking on that model, of using them, then we really need to have an escape plan or an exit plan for that orthotic, because it should be just used, if you're going to use them, to decrease load for a period of time while you're doing some rehab. Yeah, and so I think that's a bit of a glitch as well. We often leave them in place for a long time, no matter why we were told to use them.
And I think people who are prescribed orthotics, they get that change in pain, and because they get that change in pain, they would naturally see the orthotic. Depending on the story they're told, but they would have to be educated quite thoroughly about why that's working. But otherwise, the perception is, oh, I put this in my shoe and my feet feel better. And I think it's important to note that that model of using something in a shoe to change load makes sense, and even changing a shoe to change loads in the feet makes sense and can help provide a period of, say, relative rest for an area while it's healing, as we talked about. But it's also important to note that there are other strategies that you could use, such as just changing your behaviors. I think that's where these became such a thing, is because in order to get around in your day, you kind of need to be on your feet. If I've hurt my arm, I can just keep this arm in a sling, or I can keep it relatively still and I can still go about my daily activities. But if I have hurt my foot, then to get around in my day, I kind of I either need to stop getting around, sit in a wheelchair, or have something like this to change the load. So it kind of makes sense how they came about and how they become so popular, so that people can get around in their day and change the load in their feet.
Yeah, while they're injured.
They're injured. But there are, I think it's also just good to note that there's other strategies that you can use to help manage an injury besides something like this, right?
Yeah, well, we prefer to rehabilitate the foot. Just like you would rehabilitate any other part of the body. There are exercises, movements, things you're exploring in the restoration program that would change the load at your foot, just like an orthotic does. It takes load off a tissue by using your foot in a different way, or it could increase the capacity of the tissue, so it's less likely to be sore.
Yeah.
That's a long-term solution to a foot issue compared to putting a Band-Aid on it to some extent. Yeah.
Because we talk a lot about wanting to increase our range of movement options. So for example, you can see with this orthotic, it's raised here, and this is bringing that arch, that medial arch shape, and it's sort of supporting that shape. And there's a lot of shoes that do this same kind of support. Whereas, and that is used in cases where people struggle to support their own arch. However, if you're able to build the strength and capacity of the area and the coordination, which is a big part of our restorative practices, you can actually teach your foot to support itself in the same way that this would do that.
Yeah,
right?
For sure, yeah. And if we look at some of the research, they often compare a custom-made device to an off-the-shelf device. We've just got some off-the-shelf devices here. They have a little bit of flexibility in them, so the foot's going to still be able to move on them, whereas often the custom-made ones are a little bit stiffer. And really, we want our foot to be able to move, like you just saw Jim's foot moving, quite readily. And when our foot moves, the muscles around it move, and then they're getting that nutrient of movement and getting stronger and are healthier. And so when we look at that custom versus off-the-shelf, this whole idea about custom orthotics, if you've experienced it, you'll have been walking on a treadmill or walking up and down, and the practitioner will be noting what they're seeing in your gait and talking to you about what might be going wrong to drive an injury or a pain. And then they'll have you sit in a chair and scan your foot non-weight bearing in a static position. And we're trying to talk about what's called a functional foot orthotic. That's what they're officially called, functional foot orthotic, a custom-made functional foot orthotic. And to scan in a non-weight bearing position is a step away from what they've just seen functionally. You could go to the next health practitioner and they might make you a custom-made orthotic, custom-made for you, yet the orthotic would turn out different to the one the last orthotic maker made. And so is this custom-made for the client? Not really. You know, if I was to get an orthotic generally means to help function. And so a hearing aid is an orthotic. And so if I took a mold of my ear and had a hearing aid made, it would be the same from one practitioner to the next. It wouldn't matter. It would be custom to my ear. With foot orthotics, there's a bit of a misnomer, you could say, about this customized process. And then we see it in the research, there is less of a difference. You know, it's not a huge difference between a customized device and an off-the-shelf device. And so, you know,
I suppose that speaks to the concept of just shifting the load somewhat, however you do that, rather than finding this perfect shape for this person's foot. Yeah, because it doesn't sound like an exact science of finding that exact right shape for an orthotic.
It's not. It's not an exact science. And you know, as a podiatrist, I still use orthotics occasionally in the short-term management of a condition, and I might use an off-the-shelf device that I even then adjust with the skills I have as a podiatrist to better suit that person, and that can be highly effective while we're doing some rehab.
Yeah.
And so I also wanted to talk today about how, if you are using orthotics, whether you have to use them forever. And this is where you might speak to a Foot Collective pro in our pro registry about your condition, because often someone's given orthotic with the idea that they have to have it, and they think that. So sometimes it's good to get some different advice.
It's a second opinion.
A second opinion. And then you don't just throw them out and stop wearing them. If your foot has become accustomed to this, any change we make has to be done very gradually. And you know, sometimes we can reduce the strength of the orthotic to start with, or you reduce the time in it in your shoes, especially if you've changed your shoes, letting your foot do some more movement and support itself, then there's probably going to be less of a need for orthotic. You could go from a customized one to an off-the-shelf one. There's different ways to reduce your use of that orthotic if you get the green light from a professional, I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes we use some soft orthotics, like a little heel raise, to help someone get used to going into a flatter shoe, or with some cushioning, because often the shoes that we recommend, which are quite thin, don't have much cushioning, and you might be accustomed to more cushioning. So even a simple heel raise like this can help you transition to less shoe or help you through an injury period. So they're not terrible, but they just need to be used in the right scenarios.
So it's really about the story that comes along with the orthotic, why people are using them, and the exit plan. Of course, there's going to be cases where long-term orthotics is a good idea, and this is why it's so case-by-case individual. It's good to review it, have a second opinion from a professional. But in the grand scheme of things, the idea is that you could use these tools to help manage symptoms and loads while you're in the process of restoring natural foot function. And almost by definition, a foot that is functioning naturally shouldn't need the extra support from extra support from an orthotic or other footwear. It should be able to function barefoot or in very minimal sort of natural footwear. And that is a process that takes time. And these tools, along with footwear, can help in that process, help navigate that process more smoothly.
Yeah, there are very few conditions that need an orthotic or benefit from orthotic in the long term. They're out there, but they're very few and far between.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great overview there. We always come back to listen to your body, self-regulation, make sure that any change you're making is gradual. And of course, if you're feeling like you're lost or stuck, then seeking out that individualized guidance so that you can make sure that you're on the right path for you. So this is actually a bonus module that was taken from our foot restoration program, which is a 12-week program that takes you through every step of the journey towards restoring your natural foot function. So if you are looking for more structured guidance on your foot health journey, then you can check out all the details of that program through the link in the description below.